The more I think about this movie, the less I think I like it. I'd still say it's fine, which I know seems absurd alongside the endless 10 out of 10s from the world's top reviewers, but then you have those who do not like it. Why? Well, my sphere is colored irritatingly by the culture war, the political commentators, this host of clickbait titles pandering to audiences who come for shallow tribalism, roasts and memery, etc. This is an unfortunate reality of the algorithm I've created for myself, being, I guess, interested in politics. But it's nonsense. There's much, much more to unpack here than whether diversifying the cast is an abomination or a triumph, or just how fiercely Emily Wilson hates or adores the source, or just how sneakily Nolan's trying to weave in whatever moral worldview we're most afraid of. There's much more to unpack here. Annoying nonsense politics aside, there's a Venn diagram of very earnest and intelligent communities who either dislike the film or feel kind of indifferent to it. Many are Odyssey or classics fans, unsurprisingly. Many are simply accomplished writers, bothered by Nolan's classic weaknesses. I personally resonate with this line of criticism quite a bit. Others, though, are bothered for more particular reasons, like they don't think the story is structured properly for Nolan's intended message. I feel a lot of this as well. I'm a bit of a mixed bag. I think it's a noble and ambitious attempt, and I think it does cleave to maybe more of the original than we might suspect. I think more of our modern morality than we might suspect, or at least the seeds of it, can actually be traced to these ancient peoples in their sort of boldly exploratory, open-minded mode of storytelling. On the one hand, these are bloody tribal heroes. They're celebrated for the exercise of cunning and power in pursuit of personal or tribal glory. Infidelity is glorified in men, while chastity is expected of women. Vengeance is visited not only on wrongdoers, but on their servants, their sisters, their infant babes. Not only is this vengeance a thing of glory, but our heroes are honor-bound, are exhorted by the gods to visit it upon their enemies. Yet in the midst of this, bizarrely, the gods also punish them for bloodshed. Here, Nolan's reading is entirely traditional. The Greeks are haunted and harried in their homecoming because of the violence they wrought on Athena's temple, on her priestesses, and on various other Trojans who, in the original, are actually very humanized. The Iliad portrays Troy as a robust and admirable culture. It has all its own heroes and dramas who would have had avid fans among the ancient audiences, as far as we can tell. They too are avenged by the gods. So in this way, it is nicely rich and layered. In another way, though, it is a totally archaic story, incoherent to our modern sensibilities. It's driven by the sort of random associations and personal agendas, oftentimes very petty agendas, of these gods. Remember, the three goddesses start off in a beauty contest, jealous of one another's popularity, so they force a mortal to choose between them, and they doom him for his choice. They doom the entire civilization. They bless Agamemnon's voyage because he sacrifices his daughter, and they intervene to ensure the Trojan horse succeeds. Then, of course, they punish the Greeks for impiety and excess once they begin their slaughter. They drive the gods, drive Odysseus' ships astray, torment him when he defends himself against their children. They warn his men not to eat the cattle on an island, then strand them on the island so they'll be forced to eat the cattle. Why not just punish them directly instead of fabricating this excuse? Somehow it's the men's fault because they ignored Odysseus, but it's Odysseus' fault because he led the men there and incurred the anger of the gods. But it's he who gets the homecoming. But it's he who's uniquely guilty and must go into exile. The point is, the story can be bizarre. If you're looking for some sort of causal logic, some sort of cumulative lessons building toward a satisfying arc, it can seem bizarre. In another sense, though, it lends itself perfectly to modern interrogation. You can view the gods whatever way you wish. You can view the angry ones as the darker forces of our psyche, driving us against our conscious will. This is why they're so fickle and callous. They're the parts of us that lack discipline and vision. You can view them as the savagery of nature, or the bloody impossibility of an ancient world in which tribal wars were fought despite our best attempts at early human rights, with sacred rituals like guest rights and common bonds of worship and of trade. Was still a bloody world. Maybe we were bound by the savagery, the scarcity of nature. You can view the positive gods as our better aspects or ideals to aspire to. Wherever the gods do bad, you can consider it a metaphor for human weakness, and wherever they do good, a metaphor for human strength. You can project yourself onto both Greeks or Trojans and mourn with the losses and celebrate the victories, and draw whatever lessons you like about courage and causality and prudence in whatever political landscape you now find yourself. The point is, we know people have discussed these stories in this way forever, and the story always changes shape. It's the nature of it as a legend to be a changing sort of thing. A story is a living piece of human being, but it always seems to keep some through line in terms of symbols, major players, and our vital themes of hubris, homecoming, and hospitality. The true power of the story is in the imagination that we bring, each new audience, each generation, with a mind to cast itself back to that time, to consider its various mysteries and motivations, and to come to conclusions relevant to us. Which means, I have to acknowledge the tidal wave of discussion we are seeing surrounding Nolan's movie. Even beyond the echo chambery, self-perpetuating machine of social media and online controversy, there is genuinely substance to discuss here. And for that reason alone, I count Nolan's Odyssey as a culturally successful thing. Even if not all that compelling or unique a work of art or storytelling, it's getting lots of us back into the classics that we remember reading as kids. Hopefully it's inspiring another wave of classic students, aspiring authors, actors, historians, maybe even a few poets. But will it be enduring? Will it contribute to the canon of our culture? That's a more complicated question. First, I'm going to talk about adaptation. What sorts of things should an adaptation be doing? What sorts of adaptations have we seen on the Odyssey, and what are the unique challenges or opportunities posed by this current iteration, the medium, the audience, the maker? Does the story we are given actually serve Nolan's goals? Is it internally coherent? How do Nolan's specific strengths and weaknesses play into what he seems to be attempting here? This video will not cover the more granular aspects of his filmmaking, his aesthetics, his dialogue, exposition, music, editing, and so on. That's all covered in another video, linked here and down below, which focuses more on his entire filmography, Nolan as such. But this one, okay, the Odyssey. First, before we discuss his interpretation, we have to establish there is no original Odyssey. In fact, it's uncertain, verging on extremely unlikely, that Homer himself was a real person. Now, I'm no classicist or whatever, so I won't put my foot too far in my mouth, but there's a lot we don't know about the formation of these texts. One of the reasons the Greeks and Romans are so great is they wrote everything down. For hundreds and hundreds of years, a large number of them wrote everything down, and therefore it was multiplied and innovated upon, and this stands in sharp contrast to many of the old Slavic works or Celtic or Germanic, so many of which were tragically diminished, eradicated. This is one of the reasons the so-called Greco-Roman culture is or appears to be so foundational to so much that follows it. But despite that, there is still a lot we don't know about the Odyssey and its formation. We know there were a lot of popular stories sort of woven together. They appealed to historic battles and heroes and gods in order to navigate ongoing religious and political rivalries. This was not only entertainment, but, as storytelling always is, was an expression of the cultural grapplings or questions of their time. These stories begin to appear around about the 8th century BC, and they tell of events back in the legendary Bronze Age cities, Mycenae and Pylos, and several other places we've been able to document extensively. But as the stories appear here, round about the 8th century BC, this Bronze Age civilization has passed into obscurity, or at least illiteracy, like Matt Damon says. We call this actually the Greek Dark Age, and the reason we think they lost their writing ability rather than just we can't find anything they wrote for several centuries is that, first of all, that would be very odd, and second of all, several hundred years down the line, they adopt a completely new script from the Phoenicians. They don't continue their script, which we do have evidence of from those places, Pylos and Mycenae and whatnot. Instead, they adopt a completely new script, and it's in this script that we find record of the Odyssey. But as we study the earliest text form, it becomes clear that it has already existed for many iterations across time and place. These stories have grown organically, scattered and orally transmitted for some number of generations already during this Dark Age. This is, of course, very, very common. Writing tends to be first used for numbers and ledgers and laws and the like, but as soon as it verges into fiction, it becomes a thing of the people, of entertainment, and these things have already started out oral. They have no fixed form. They have no traceable original form until they are put to text. By way of comparison, look at Sir Thomas Malory, who compiled King Arthur in the 15th century. 15th! Much more recent, when we were writing lots more down. We already don't know who he is. And Malory's taking translations of French stories, which were compiled from some sort of Celtic, possibly primarily Welsh oral tradition through the preceding centuries. Now, because it was much more recent, we can say there was an original Mallory, but we can't say there was an original King Arthur. And even when we know broadly which sources Mallory, drew from, we're often unsure as to which specific versions he used and why he made the many editorial choices that he did. How much more impossible, then, when over an equal period of time and in a far less literate, or at least a far less recorded place, how much more impossible to suppose that we can identify some original Odyssey. These people didn't have internet, didn't have printing press, and even as they did develop writing, most people still would not be able to write. It might take 6 months for news of a far-off battle to reach whatever place. You're a bard performing before these people, and they would want to know its relevance to them. You put in things they know about, the enemies, the rulers, the allies, and heroic attributes. You swap the gods, foreign gods for local gods, or distant gods for local gods. You swap a talisman or two. This happens over and over again, and it's not happening in a linear manner. It's happening many places, all at once. Okay, what's the point? The point is, the text of the Odyssey springs out with layers of artistic recreation already baked in. This is the living nature of old stories. To pretend at some faithful original adaptation is delusion. The text version springs out like Athena, full-fledged, armed with spear and wisdom, but she's been alive for generations already, acting and evolving through this haze of oral tradition. Then after a couple hundred years, we have the Athenians, attempting to codify this in a certain structure for performance. Then we have the Alexandrians, gathering and comparing endlessly and sort of inventing textual criticism for the purpose of formalizing these old writings, which is cool. But, of course, much of that is lost, and in another sense, the first complete edition we have is in Italian from around the 10th century AD. So a historically original Odyssey is nonsensical for the same reason a historical King Arthur, or Gilgamesh, or Noah's Ark, or Roland and Oliver, or Siegfried, or Robin Hood, for the same reason these are nonsensical. Beyond that, we cannot hear the Odyssey as the originals did. We cannot. The experience of hearing poetry is vastly different than the experience of going to a film. The experience of seafaring pre-digital warriors is vastly different than that of us with our computers, ChatGPTs, centuries of science suggesting that lightning is an electrostatic discharge, not some weapon hurled by the sky god. We cannot discover a new land the same as our forefathers did. We cannot approach a strange city the same as they did. Okay, and maybe I will get a bit political for a second because this is amusing. Those who rail desperately at any hint of alteration are often those same ones who are seeking to protect the idea that there's some common through line of Judeo-Christian thought that grounds Western Enlightenment and classical liberalism and Anglo-Saxon tradition and all such things. We are heirs to some set of original and more pure ideas, and we meddle with them at our peril, that sort of thing. Now, that sort of thing does have merit, of course. Old ideas everywhere should have merit. We should treat our ancestors with respect. We should learn. We were only able to arrive here because of the people that came before us, because they fought this long and bloody battle against ignorance, against wilderness and scarcity and all our dreadful preconceptions. We should not read history as some sort of moral judge. We should read it as perpetrators, certainly as much as victims. But we should read it even more as humans, trying to learn about ourselves as one being with these people we're trying to puzzle out and understand through all this mystery and haze. So, we should respect the past. But we should also meddle, and the political defenders of our Judeo-Christian roots embrace meddling just as much as any of us. Jesus, remember, was a revolutionary. Definitely. Ironically, it's in this very vein of meddling that you see Homer's Odyssey being adapted by Virgil into a more familiar Judeo-Christian form. Virgil uses it to justify Roman dominion and morality. He casts Odysseus in a somewhat crueler, more war-crimey sort of light. He suggests that the Romans, descended from the Aeneas who fled Troy, of course, the Trojan, the Romans have now established a more evolved morality, which is a step closer to Christian. By the way, the Aeneid, it's quite funny. Zeus, Jupiter just monologues for a while about there will be this race of absolute chads called Romans, and they should just really subjugate and extort everyone, and lo, they shall spread across the earth in glory. They're just the greatest, and that's pretty based. So Virgil's stuff is transmitted in Latin, so medieval Europe ends up taking a lot more inspiration from Virgil than from Homer. And pretty soon you have Dante, who does that evil meddling again to write himself, being led through hell by Virgil, who reveals that Odysseus is now in the 8th circle, that is a bad circle, of hell, and he's there for his deceit and pride. Wow. So we started with Athena aiding Odysseus in his return, urging him on enthusiastically so he may usher bloody slaughter in, to use her words. Then we have Virgil, who condemns Odysseus for his crimes against the Trojans, but still appeals to the same gods and still grants Odysseus his connection to him, grants that he was aided and favored by several gods in his journey. Then we have Dante, who portrays Odysseus as severed from God for all eternity, tormented for his fraud and his bloody arrogance. 3 different versions across many centuries, coming into greater and greater alignment with our current moral sensibilities, all through the very sort of meddling The Daily Wire and Metatron and Critical Drinker, all of them call abomination. Now, can meddling be abomination? Yes. Yes. So how do you know whether a change is an abomination or simply the ongoing nature of the myth, the living nature of the myth? Generally, there are 3 ways to evaluate an adaptation. First, is it true to the source material? This is tough for all the reasons I've been describing. Are we trying to understand the source material as a sequence of political events? Are we trying to draw life lessons from the story? Are we trying to understand the psyche of the ancient Greek? Are we discussing his gods in some sort of Jungian way as a set of impulses or powers that possess and drive us from within? Are we discussing translation? Are we comparing pagan to Christian morality? For the most part, obviously, how we even evaluate whether something stays true to the source material depends on what we value. Second, alternatively, you can simply embrace this changeful nature and consider whether an adaptation speaks to what you currently value or can use. Some things we can't really use, so they're less interesting to weave into the story. For example, it's tough for us, the modern mind, to conceive of how the Greeks might have tolerated or even celebrated Odysseus's war crimes or Telemachus's butchery of the serving women, or, unless you're Andrew Tate, how the Greeks might have celebrated his infidelity with Circe as Penelope suffers decades waiting faithfully for his return. In these ways, Nolan's changes are absolutely sensible. He's just shifting the focus to things more relevant to us. Then again, Odysseus' child with Circe does come back to kill Odysseus in certain versions, so maybe the ancients did have our sense of justice. But this wasn't in the original. Even this would have already been a travesty if we were looking for some faith to some original. Also, noteworthy, of course, as has been memed, it would be a travesty to have a woman playing Helen, because she would be played, ironically enough, in travesty by man. The point is, what we value is already constraining this conversation a good deal. Look at the so-called culture war. It matters to some of us, apparently, that white culture not be erased, or that we see more black representation in our casting. So that becomes a point of focus and contention. The whole entire movie, the whole spirit of the film becomes reduced to this one factor, as if this single unidimensional variable is driving every single aspect of every single decision made by every single person working on the movie. It's tiring. Now, a cultural discussion we're not involved in, thankfully, is one regarding whether slavery or rape or hanging serving women can be justified. We have ideas like human rights and war crimes. We can discuss whether the Trojan horse would be considered perfidy, illegal and immoral, or a ruse of war, defensible and clever. So there's a spectrum of relevance here, and the conversations we engage in will be different than the conversations of our ancestors. We have our own set of rules for hospitality, for how to treat allies, refugees, and suitors. The nuances of these could be interesting, but only if we make them relevant to modern thought. Maybe we're interested in considering just how alien their morality might be to us. We could combine this with some sort of mysticism and a sort of journey through the psyche, and we get the Northman. Maybe on top of that, we're interested in expanding on the politics of some bygone era. We get Game of Thrones, family drama. Maybe we don't need to consider the psychology of violent glory because we feel so far removed. Maybe there are simply more pressing matters to consider. Leadership and duty, long-suffering, shame, loneliness. As a side note, I will say PTSD isn't really the right descriptor for what Matt Damon's Odysseus is going through. It's more like guilt or shame or sorrow, maybe a sort of weariness, resignation, not PTSD. But which of all these things is Nolan trying to address? There's a third criterion for our adaptation. So 1, is an adaptation true to the source material? 2, does it address something we value? 3, does it satisfy the creator's aim? And I should also mention a point 4, which applies across the board. An adaptation should always be internally coherent. This is storytelling 101. Alongside things like character richness or tension, believability, the fluidity of the actual writing. Alongside those, this is where much of my critique is focused when I look at a narrative work. These things are, for me, the heart of what it is that we are doing when we engage in story. These are what makes something resonate and succeed, regardless of broader disagreements. So for the rest of this video, we'll turn our attention to Nolan's Odyssey, and we'll evaluate it according to this paradigm that I've laid out. What sorts of values and emotions is Nolan aiming to explore? Is his exploration internally coherent? Can we suspend disbelief enough to accept and resonate with what's going on? We can start by identifying 3 major themes: Nostos, Xenia, and hubris. Let's say homecoming, hospitality, and hubris. Everywhere these things appear, there's a tension between competing desires. Odysseus thirsts for an immortal sort of glory, Kleos, like Achilles, but he wants none of Achilles' consequences. He wants vengeance on those who abused his sacred hospitality, but he abuses Athena's sacred temple. He wants to reclaim his throne, his weapons, and his marriage bed, but he turns his back on monogamy. And interestingly, in a later edition, it is his son by Circe that ends up being his demise. He's glorious and capable, but because of this, he wants to exist outside the natural order and its consequences. It's often suggested that the Odyssey is one of our oldest hero's journeys. Our hero goes out into the wasteland. He's stripped down to something fundamental, to his will, cunning, his capacity to suffer or to learn. He comes back with a recovered name, an expanded wisdom, an expanded authority. Classic hero's journey stuff. In other ways, though, as I've said, the Odyssey seems too ancient for our modern paradigm. Our modern paradigm with its clean dualism of strengths and weaknesses, virtues to be refined and vices to be burnt away, like dross. The hero's journey is fundamentally harmonious. The characters follow a discernible arc with a cumulative logic by which they grow in power and arrive, in the end, at some sort of promising future. The Odyssey seems weirder, almost more random, in a way. I've actually devoted an entire video to this called Old Stories Are Weird and Maybe Simple, so check that out if you find it interesting. But here I'm going to stay a bit more specific to Nolan's choices. Many of the changes he made were aimed, I think very sensibly, at diminishing the weirdness of the story. Nolan's a guy who pursues very explicitly a vibe of singular thematic focus. This becomes obvious when you listen to the end monologues of his every single movie. He wants there to be a point, and he's willing to bend the entire story to that end, and he wants it to usually be pretty articulable. This is actually a major criticism that I have, which I discuss more in that aforementioned video on the granular aspects of Nolan's filmmaking. The cuts, the dialogue, exposition, the flashbacks, blah, blah, blah. That one actually does end up discussing the Odyssey in detail, but it's more focused on his weaknesses, so you might consider it the straw man of Nolan's Odyssey, whereas this is maybe the steel man. I don't know. One of the reasons I think Nolan was ill-suited to adapt the Odyssey is this very focus that he has on building and building and building the momentum of the entire film up to a single driven point. I just don't think the Odyssey is very suited for this approach. But, given that, I think Nolan's changes do make sense. Let's go through a list. First, Aeolus and the Bag of Winds. This one always stuck in my mind from my reading as a child. A bag of winds. I found it delightful. And it's a trope, of course, that appears across much of our mythology, but it was so cool. So basically, Odysseus meets the god of winds, who gives him a bag with all the winds except the gentle west wind. This is to help Odysseus make it home. Now, Odysseus, in his fashion, doesn't tell his men what's in the bag. This makes them jealous and suspicious, sure that it's some sort of fancy gift like gold and jewels. They open the bag, releasing the winds and sending their ship hairy-scary across the waves. This could fit with Nolan's telling in that Odysseus is grim and pensive and keeps to himself. His natural tendency toward secrecy, toward controlling information, bites him in the butt here. It also fits with the theme of Odysseus's men causing endless trouble and him saving them through his wits and favor from the supernatural forces of the world. On the other hand, this is a bit tangential to Nolan's primary theme, and it doesn't fit with later episodes in which Odysseus is required to deceive his men in order to save them, as with Scylla and Charybdis. So, I'm not sure. It's a bit random, not vital to the story, not really related to Nolan's overarching theme here of sanctity and violence. It seems like a fine omission. Okay, second, and perhaps more significant, the Phaeacians are omitted. So, in the epic, The Phaeacians are the final stopping place before Odysseus' home. In stark contrast to the endless traps and savagery of his journey thus far, Phaeacia is an utter paradise. The people welcome him in the proper way. Much of Odysseus' actual narrative is framed here, and as he praises his hosts and as they lade him with luxury and comfort, they stand in stark contrast to the other figures he's met along the way. They represent the ideal, everything that has been violated by Polyphemus, Circe, Calypso, the Lystrigonians, Poseidon, the suitors back in Ithaca, and so on. Also noteworthy, Odysseus weeps in Phaeacia. He actually weeps almost constantly throughout the entire story. This is another thing that might surprise us or sit in contrast to our impression of these sort of ancient alien sensibilities. He is incredibly expressive. Many of the men, many of the heroes, they're always weeping and embracing and expressing endless love for one another, sorrow for the past, longing for their women, honor for their hosts or their fallen brethren or even their enemies, and so on. They have a very poetic and wistful sort of manliness, like David singing to Jonathan in the Bible. And the epic, Menelaus, played here incongruously by John Bernthal, he weeps over Telemachus, they say it in the movie. I've just always said it, Telemachus. He begs him to move nearby. He and Helen both express great love for one another. Helen praises Odysseus, and then she goes on a whole rant about how she knew he was in the horse, but she was so awed by his glory and his courage, she elected not to tell the Trojans. Indeed, she had begun already to regret her foolishness in joining Paris. She mourned the many Greek deaths. She prayed for their victory. She feels guilty in some way for Odysseus' separation from his own wife, which, yeah, this does wrap around in some roundabout way to reconcile with Nolan's version, where Helen apologizes to Telemachus for everything she'd caused, But listen to this, in Helen's own words. I cannot tell of all the challenges steadfast Odysseus has undergone, but I will tell you what that brave man did at Troy when the Achaeans were in trouble. He beat himself and bruised his body badly, and put a ragged cloak on, like a slave, then shuffled through the enemy city streets. In his disguise he seemed a poor beggar, hardly a man to sail with the Achaeans. He crept through Troy. I saw through his disguise and questioned him. He was too smart to talk, acting evasive, but I washed and scrubbed him with oil and dressed him, and I swore an oath that I would not reveal him to the Trojans before he had got back to his own camp. He told me all the things the Greeks were planning. On his way back, he used his long bronze sword to slaughter many Trojans, and he brought useful intelligence to tell the Greeks. The Trojan women keened in grief, but I was glad. By then I wanted to go home. I wished that Aphrodite had not made me go crazy when she took me from my country, and made me leave my daughter in the bed I shared with my fine, handsome, clever husband. So yeah, and of course Helen's been reinterpreted by many different tellers across many different times. But this is an interpretation of the original. Given Nolan's aim, it makes sense to leave this out. It makes sense to leave out the weeping, loving men and all their expressions of affection. Nolan is trying to tell a story about guilt and violence and the violation of the sacred. He's trying to do this in 3 hours. He can't meander. He can't indulge full realism or romanticism. In the original, the Phaeacians serve as a convenient storytelling device, a frame story that allows Odysseus to recount his story with a sort of engineered suspense, and in stark contrast with his generous hosts and all the paradise he's enjoying there. His generous hosts then stand in contrast to his homecoming, providing an example of perfect hospitality to highlight the decadence of his suitors. This simply wouldn't fit with Nolan's vision, where the violation of Troy and of Ithaca is representative of a civilizational collapse. In Homer, Troy's fall is divinely willed, and then Odysseus is a hero who returns home and enacts this cathartic, glorious vengeance. But this simply doesn't square with other aspects of the story. Okay, what else did Nolan omit? The nobody scene. Odysseus never calls himself nobody. He never converses with the Cyclops. He never woos him and gets him drunk before blinding him. It's all a bit strange, or all a bit more implausible, this Cyclops just laying down, exposing himself to them, apparently trusting so much in his size and strength and in their need for him to move the rock that they're not going to do anything to him. It's just a bit more bizarre, a bit less plausible in some ways. It makes the Cyclops seem a bit more brutish. Because yes, in the original, he's conversed with. He has to be tricked into letting down his guard. And the nobody joke. I know, this is almost sacrilege because it's probably the most famous scene from the whole Odyssey, maybe. I don't know. When I've thought of the Odyssey ever since reading it as a 10-year-old or whatever, I've always thought of the winds, the Cyclops, the Lotus Forgetfulness, which seems like an interesting and freaky idea, and the 12 axe heads. Which, by the way, what? Why? Why does he need to make it so much lamer with the axe heads? Just to do something new? I just don't get it. I mean, it's such an iconic and lovely moment. 12 axe heads, 12 axe eyes, the little round bit, where the shaft goes in. That's probably what it means, although there are other variations where people have axe heads with circles in them or weird loopy designs. But way better than 6 gaps made by that general part of the axe near the head sort of tied together, so the shaft and the head together make a whole 6 of them. Anyway, the Cyclops and nobody. Let's be honest. The pun would be cringe in modern English, in this modern medium. I'm no ancient Greekist, so don't trust me, but there's an interesting Reddit post, linked below, where a guy unpacks some wild layers to this word nobody and how it fits in the grammar of the sentence, and how things stressed a certain way are coherent and sensible, and another way are bewildering. And then there's all the bits with nobody is killing me by trickery, not by force, and Polyphemus's cousins interpret it like neither by trickery nor by force, and this all has to do with ancient Greek and its structure. And then his cousins are like, wow, you must just be ill then if no one's killing you by either means. And yeah, look, it's already a story with soldiers inside wooden horses and witches turning men to pigs and a bow that can't be strung except by our legendary hero. But these things have sort of layers to them, or satisfying symbolism, or enough haze for plausible deniability. The nobody thing is an explicit and cerebral sort of pun in a more modern, explicit sort of interaction. I think it would seem wacky. I'm happy he left it out. Okay. What else does Nolan change? Athena. She appears much less violent in this version. Don't forget that in the original, the entire reason for the war is Athena's anger at Paris, Helen, and Troy and Tyre. Why? Well, Paris chose Aphrodite and her gift of lust and beauty over Athena and her wisdom. So, Athena in her wisdom wants Troy sacked, and she helps the Greeks to that end. Then, once Ajax defiles her temple, and only because he defiles her temple, and the Greeks fail to condemn him, then she turns her wrath on the Greeks as they make the journey home. She is not a goddess of Geneva Conventions or modern sensibilities. She is a territorial and vindictive thing with an old world sense of justice. But yes, the seeds are there. The seeds. Human progress is, as ever, a thing of mortal seeds we seek to nurture towards transcendent ideals. This old world sensibility does allow us to derive moral lessons from these things. Yes, it gives us lessons of allegiance, loyalty, faith, brotherhood, but sort of within the tribe, not universal humanism. Maybe that's where our morality always needs to start, within some sort of tribe. Maybe that's why religion has been so successful. It expands the tribe beyond kin lines to belief lines. In this view, Nolan's version of Athena isn't an abandonment of the story and its tradition. So imagine a thread, if you will, that is split from the original bards to have one strand then handed to Virgil, then later split and handed again to Dante, and now split and split and split and split to James Joyce, Atwood, Tennyson, Pasolini, Madeline Miller, Minghella, and most recently to Nolan. He continues very much in Dante's vein, interrogating the characters for moral failure, and he arrives at this very cosmic, broad-level analysis of violence and the sacred and civilizational guilt. He makes the gods just hazy and elemental enough to allow any sort of interpretation. Maybe they're forces of the natural world, maybe they're forces of the mind, maybe they're civilizational norms. Zendaya and Sinon become a sort of embodiment maybe of Odysseus' conscience. Look, maybe you can view him as sort of generically the hero of the story, if you want. His men aren't significant, if you want to take that tack. Or maybe they all represent the same thing. They all represent some essential human mind, whether individual or universal. They're the essential human conscience and its struggle with questions of morality and courage, homecoming and loyalty and vengeance. And Odysseus is the kind of the wakeful one, the reflective one, that part of our mind. The hero and the leader is that part of us that can redeem the rest. He's the part of us that can learn, perhaps the highest part of us that prays and supplicates the gods, but also, therefore, that highest part of us which dares defy them, dares defy the shape of things. He is the one who dominates civilization's status quo, yet the one who innovates atop it. You could view it all as some sort of analog for the consciousness of a single individual, maybe. Maybe in a way he's the only one on the entire journey. I'm actually quite happy with this. It's an entirely appropriate and interesting endeavor. It's, ironically enough, very Christian. It's the most Christian aspect of modern morality and sensibility. But there is a sticking point here, which is that Nolan is just bad at writing, and the story is already weird. He's bad at writing, the story is weird and disjointed, and the things that make it resonate are not the things Nolan is good at. For more on that, though, you'll have to check out my next video, focused on his broader style, cuts and flashbacks and action and so on, but maybe more particularly his writing. So it will be called Nolan Has a Style Problem, maybe, something like that. I haven't uploaded it yet. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Farewell for now.